Alright guys, so the stack has been resting for 5 days now, and we should be good to start moving on with some of this, because after 5 days, usually that's when most of your parts are going to do whatever moving they're going to do. Again, like I said before, the longer you can leave it, the better. So if you're someone that works a full-time job or that during the week, you can just leave your stuff for the whole week, come back on the weekend and get to work on it. That'll be ideal. But there's also one thing that I forgot to mention, is that when you're making your stack, what you want to do is whatever parts you're planning to work on next, you want to try and keep them near the top, because currently I want to work on the legs and the vertical parts of each of these pieces of furniture, and all of those are right at the bottom of the stack here. So the better thing for me to have done would have been to just kind of stack everything and then stack the legs on top, because I know that the legs are going to be the first thing I'm going to work on. So when you're making your stack, just keep that in mind. Whatever you're going to work on next, just try and keep it near the top. It'll make your life a little easier later on. But anyway, that's what we're going to be doing today, is we're just going to be working on getting all of our leg pieces milled out to their final dimensions, and then we're going to be cutting all of our mortise and tin joinery in them today. So the milling process is nothing really spectacular. We're just trying to take these semi-squared up blanks, turn them completely square, so that when we take them over to the mortise or later on, we can actually cut some nice clean joinery into them. So that's going to be the first stage, is just squaring up these blanks. Okay, so we've got our leg stock all perfectly squared up now. It's absolutely amazing what you can do when you actually put some time and effort into the milling process. And so to break down the milling process, the steps are basically you want to start on the jointer and get two of your faces squared up to each other. So the first pass is just a normal jointing pass. The second pass, you're going to reference that back fence. Those two faces should be, pretty much 90 degrees to each other. And before I started doing any of this, I went through and re-squared up my fence on my jointer. In the past, I've talked a lot about, when I'm doing stuff with the jointer, I don't generally worry about my fence too much. I generally will try and square things up on the table saw here because it's a little bit easier and a little bit more accurate. But in this case, when I'm dealing with this many legs that I have to make and put together, having the fence on my jointer perfectly at 90 degrees just makes the whole process way easier. And it does take a few minutes to set up, but again, the time saved compared to running all these pieces multiple times through the table saw is, it's definitely there. That being said, obviously, you guys watched me put these pieces through the table saw after the jointer. Now, the reason for that was to remove the bulk of the material and to relieve whatever stress was going to get relieved. So most of these pieces, I just took off, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, just a nice dusting pass on the edges. Other of them, I took off the full 3/32 of the blade plus a little bit extra, and that actually did relieve quite a bit of stress in some of these shorter legs, which was really important because then before I could go and get them down to their final size, I could rejoint that edge that had warped after I'd taken off, about 1/8 of an inch of material. So that's the big trick there, and especially when you're doing stuff like this, that's what you got to watch out for. Now, surprisingly enough, the short legs is where I had the most problem, which luckily enough, I had a lot of extra material on the short legs. The long ones, especially the really long ones, the 54-inch ones, no issue the whole time. They jointed perfectly. They went through all the machinery just perfectly. I don't know what's up with that. Normally, the longer pieces are where you're going to have the most trouble with. I guess I just got lucky on this one. But I also do think it had something to do with the fact that I let them rest for a few days. That definitely helped out with keeping everything, pretty square. So then once I was done at the table saw, I went back over the jointer, cleaned up two faces again, doing a very light skimming pass. So basically when you're edge jointing, when you're typically just using your jointer, you're going to be taking off, if you have a small jointer like I have, you're going to be taking anywhere off from a 1/16 to maybe just under 1/8 of an inch. You're taking off a decent amount. When you're doing just a skimming pass, you want to put some pencil on there, make a pass, and you want to just barely have that pencil disappear. Then obviously the final step was to go over to the planer. Now I've talked about this a lot before in the past too, is when I'm doing square legs like this, I don't generally like using the planer because if you have any error in your legs, it's just going to compound it. So if I'm not perfectly 90 on my faces, the planer is just going to make it worse. But again, because I took the specific time before I started milling all this to get my jointer fence set to that perfect 90 degrees, I could then trust my planer to do all this. And the stock removal on the planer is way easier because you're just passing the piece through. And so the last step here is going to be cutting them down to final length. So on the nightstand legs, obviously they're not too bad. They're only 28 inches or 29 inches long. It's easy to do on my table saw here. The trick is with the tall dresser, those legs are about 54 inches long. This is another good time to mention with that 50 tooth combination blade you guys already saw early in the video. I used that to do all the ripping on all of these same pieces on this 8/4 stock, so that's a pretty good ripping blade that it didn't do any massive burning or damage. And then I just used that same blade for cross cutting, and that is just about the most beautiful cross cutting I've seen without using something like a 60 or 80 tooth designated blade. Alright, so I've got all the mortises laid out on my pieces here. This is one of the legs for one of the nightstands, and so all I've done is I've just gone out and marked the width of where the mortise is going to be, or the vertical area. Because when I go and actually set up the mortiser, I'm going to set up the fence to specifically set up each area, so it's going to be a lot easier. So for example, when I'm cutting these vertical mortises on the side here, I know I don't have to worry about marking in a depth because I know that I'm going to set up the fence 3/16 with the bit 3/16 of an inch away from this edge here. So, and then I'll just run through all of my vertical mortises and just do them all at once, flipping the pieces around as needed. So again, same thing on the on the side profile of this leg here. We've got some mortises that are going to be on the inside of the leg, some that are going to be on the outside of the leg. And again, all I have to do is, as long as I know that my bit is 3/16 of an inch away from the edge here, I just have to spin the piece around in the mortiser, cut the other side. It's going to be super quick and easy once we actually get this running. And then so same thing with the horizontal mortises. While I'm cutting the other ones, I can start to cut those ones as well. Because all I have to do is just make the first punch in on one side. Then when I flip it around, I can make the first punch in the other side. And that will be perfectly in line with my other mortises that are already on my leg here. All right, so we're a little more than halfway through cutting of our mortises on all of our pieces with the mortiser here. And I have to say that my love for this machine, this way of cutting mortises, is starting to wane a little bit. Now, that being said, I'm not going to get rid of this machine anytime soon. It does definitely give you some capabilities that you just can't get with any other tool, like being able to cut mortises into 3/4 inch stock. So it's definitely a machine I'm going to keep around. I just have to figure out a better way to do what I'm doing here. And so it's not really a problem with the mortiser itself, it's more a problem with just the technique in general. So the Powermatic mortiser that I have is really well built. It's got plenty of horsepower, it's got very good lowering actions, it's very easy to apply a decent amount of pressure. The problem that I'm having is with the bit. So on the first set that I did, I was able to do like the first 6 legs of the nightstands without having to sharpen the bit. It ran through there, all no issue, because there's only a few mortises per leg, so it was pretty quick and easy. But now that I've gotten onto the wide dresser with the slightly longer legs, I'm basically having to sharpen the auger bit after each leg and the chisel after every 2 to 3 legs, because it's just getting dull so quickly and it's building up so much heat. And so that is, again, kind of the exact issue with these things, and why they've been kind of phased out of any kind of production work, is because that auger bit just heats up so quickly. Now, ideally, what I could do is I could go on to Lee Valley, I could order a bunch of the auger bits and just constantly be swapping out the auger bit. After every leg, just swapping a new auger bit. That would be a pretty easy thing to do, because all you do, you just loosen the chuck, drop the auger bit out, throw a new one in, and you're good, and you keep going. But the trick is that's expensive. Each of those auger bits costs about $30. The mortise chisel, the whole set, the chisel and the auger bit, is about $80 to $90. So they're not cheap tools. And the problem is they don't function very well, if that makes sense. Again, I've talked about this lots before, and I've defended mortisers, and a lot in general, because I do think that they are still a valuable machine, but they're just not something that is meant for production work. So things like when I'm making breadboard ends, that's a really good use for this thing, because I'm working in narrow 3/4 inch stock, where there's not really any good way to cut a mortise into that stock normally, because you can't use a router to plunge in there. You can't really do a domino joiner theoretically, but that's not true mortise, or that's not true breadboard end joinery, so it's not as cool. So that's where a mortiser like this really comes in handy. But when you're doing stuff like this, where you're just cranking out a ton of mortises on leg stock, I think that there has to be a better way to do this. Oh yeah, and something else that should be mentioned, I'm not going to be getting a domino joiner anytime soon. For one, they're stupid expensive, which I just can't afford that right now, and buying the dominoes, all that is stupid expensive. And I also have some major issues with the way that domino joinery works. If you've ever looked into how that works, basically it cuts an oversized mortise and then you fit in that loose tenon, and it's got a lot of play to it. Whereas, one of the things that I love about mortise and tenon joinery is that you can get a precise fit. So you can exactly fit up your piece into this mortise here and not have any play to it. So I don't really like the way that domino joiners work, but I may have to figure something out here, because something needs to change here really quickly. Okay, so we've got all of our mortises cut now. Now we're going to go through and do a little bit of cleanup on them. So I've talked about this lots before. The mortiser is more of a brute force machine than a precise, accurate machine. There's a lot of flex in that mortise chisel, and just the way that it's designed, it's not meant to cut a perfectly aligned mortise. Also, you're pretty much eyeballing every single cut, so there's going to be some variance in there. So I've already gone through and sharpened up my chisels. I've got my 1/2 inch and my 3/8 inch. Both of them are razor sharp. They're all ready to go. The reason I chose those 2 chisels is because 3/8 is the same width as our mortises, so I can easily go in on the ends and just clean those up if need be. And then the 1/2 inch is just easier to sharpen. I've got my 3/4 inch chisel, but it's in pretty rough shape right now, and I don't feel like going through all the effort of trying to resharpen that one. So the 1/2 inch was pretty much ready to go, just needed a quick sharpen to it. And so all we're going through and doing here is just touching up our mortises. We're not going through and really cutting anything. Most of these mortises I don't even have to worry about touching. I just want to go through and make sure that I actually have them opened up to my lines as close as possible. And they're just nice and even across, because there are some cases, this being a perfect example, where the mortise chisel was just a little bit too low. So I'm just going to go back, cut down to my line there, and then that mortise will be perfect and ready to go. And the other thing that is important to understand about using a mortiser to cut mortises is that your mortises don't need to be perfectly straight across. So again, in the case of our horizontal mortises, some of them are a little bit wavy. But again, all that I have to do is when I actually cut my tenons to fit in here, I just have to go in and either use my block plane to take a little bit of material off those tenons, or again, I could just come back in here and clean them up a little bit. Either way is going to work just fine, and this is a heck of a lot easier than hand cutting these. If I had to hand cut all of these mortises, that would have been an absolute nightmare. That probably would have taken, kind of a few days to get that done.